Keith Richards fell asleep mid-sentence during David Letterman's interview on live TV. The audience laughed, Letterman made jokes. Then Keith woke up and said 7 words that silenced 40 million viewers. "My grandfather died in my arms yesterday." What Letterman did next shocked everyone, and the footage is still used in journalism schools to teach the difference between entertainment and humanity. It was February 1981, and Keith Richards was scheduled to appear on Late Night with David Letterman. The show was only a few months old, and Letterman was still finding his voice as a late-night host. He'd built his brand on irreverent humor, playful mockery, and a willingness to make his guests the butt of jokes. It was working. Audiences loved his unpredictable style, and the show was gaining momentum against Johnny Carson's dominance. Keith had been touring relentlessly for months, but 2 days earlier he'd received a call from England that changed everything. His grandfather, Theodore Augustus Dupree, was dying. Theodore was 91 years old and had been battling pneumonia for weeks. Keith immediately flew to England, canceling 3 shows to be there. He arrived at the hospital 12 hours before Theodore died. Keith sat by his grandfather's bedside through the night, holding his hand, talking to him about music, about life, about all the things Theodore had taught him. Theodore died at dawn, with Keith holding him. The old man's last words were about the guitar he'd given Keith decades earlier, the same guitar Johnny Carson had mocked, the same guitar Keith had given to the dying boy on the Andy Williams show. "That guitar," Theodore whispered, "made you who you are. I'm proud of you, Keith." Then he closed his eyes and was gone. Keith sat with his grandfather's body for another hour before hospital staff gently suggested he leave. Keith had a choice then. He could cancel all his commitments and stay in England for the funeral, or he could honor his grandfather's memory by continuing to work, continuing to make music, continuing to do what Theodore had taught him to do. Keith chose the latter. He flew back to New York less than 24 hours after his grandfather died. He went straight from the airport to a rehearsal, then to a recording session, then to the Letterman taping. He hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. He was running on grief, exhaustion, and the muscle memory of professionalism. Nobody at the Letterman show knew what Keith was going through. His publicist hadn't mentioned it. Keith had specifically asked her not to. "I don't want sympathy," Keith had said. "I just want to work. Work is what my grandfather would want." So when Keith arrived at NBC Studios in Rockefeller Center, the production staff saw what they expected to see. Keith Richards, the eternal rock and roller, looking a bit rough, but that was normal for Keith. The show went live at 12:30 a.m. Letterman did his monologue, bantered with Paul Schaefer and the band, and then introduced Keith with his trademark sarcasm. "My next guest is Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. He's here to talk about the new album, or possibly to take a nap. Let's find out which. Please welcome Keith Richards." The audience laughed and applauded as Keith walked out. Keith sat down and shook Letterman's hand. Up close, Letterman could see that Keith looked worse than usual, more gaunt, more tired, eyes red and unfocused. But Letterman plowed ahead with his planned questions. "Keith, great to have you here. How's the tour going?" Keith answered in a monotone. "It's going. We're playing. People seem to like it." Letterman tried a joke. "That's high praise coming from you. People seem to like it. That's practically a rave review from Keith Richards." The audience laughed. Keith didn't. He just sat there, staring somewhere past Letterman. Letterman tried another question. "So, the new album, Tattoo You, it's doing well. Are you happy with how it turned out?" Keith started to answer. "Yeah, we worked hard on it. We tried to..." And then, mid-sentence, Keith's eyes closed. His head dropped slightly. He was asleep. For a moment, everyone thought it was a bit, some kind of joke, but Keith didn't move. He was actually sleeping, sitting upright in his chair on live television. The audience began to laugh nervously.
Letterman looked at the camera with exaggerated shock. "Ladies and gentlemen, Keith Richards has fallen asleep during my interview. I've heard of boring guests to sleep, but this is the first time I've managed to bore a guest into unconsciousness."
The audience laughed harder. Letterman was on a roll now, playing to the crowd. "Someone check if he's still breathing. Keith? Keith, can you hear me? Should we get a paramedic or just let him sleep it off?" More laughter. Paul Schaefer played a little musical sting. Letterman turned to the audience. "This is great television, folks. Real cutting-edge stuff. My guest is actually asleep. NBC is gonna love this." This went on for nearly 2 minutes. Letterman making jokes, the audience laughing, Keith sleeping peacefully in his chair. It was funny. It was unexpected. It was exactly the kind of chaos that made Letterman's show must-watch television. Then Keith woke up. His eyes opened slowly, and he looked around, momentarily confused about where he was. Letterman seized the moment. "Welcome back, Keith. You were out for a while there. Have a nice nap?" The audience laughed again, expecting Keith to laugh along, to play into the joke. But Keith didn't laugh. He looked at Letterman with an expression that was hard to read. Sadness, exhaustion, something deeper. Then Keith spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "My grandfather died in my arms yesterday." The studio went completely silent. The laughter died instantly. Letterman's smile froze on his face. Keith continued, "I flew to England 2 days ago, sat with him through the night. He died at dawn. I held him while he took his last breath. Then I got on a plane and came here, because I thought that's what he'd want. But I guess I'm more tired than I thought." Nobody in the studio moved. 40 million viewers watching at home sat in shock. Letterman looked like he'd been physically struck. His face went from comedy to horror in seconds. "Keith," Letterman said, his voice completely different now, all the sarcasm gone. "I am so sorry. I didn't know. If I had known—" Keith shook his head slightly. "You couldn't have known. I didn't tell anyone." Letterman looked at his producers in the wings, clearly wanting guidance on what to do. Should they cut to commercial? Should they end the interview? But before anyone could decide, Keith started talking. "My grandfather's name was Theodore Augustus Dupree. He was born in Wales in 1910. He fought in World War I and came back with what they called shell shock. Couldn't work, couldn't sleep, had nightmares every night. The only thing that helped him was music. He'd sit in his room with his guitar, playing for hours." Keith's voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. "He gave me that guitar when I was young, told me to use it to help people the way it helped him. And I've tried. I've really tried. Every time I play, I'm doing what he taught me, making music that matters, connecting with people, helping them feel less alone." Letterman listened, no longer trying to entertain, just listening. He was 91. He had a good life, but that doesn't make it easier, you know. The interview had transformed into something else entirely, no longer entertainment, but a moment of genuine human connection. Letterman, to his credit, rose to the occasion. "Keith, I made jokes about you falling asleep. I turned your exhaustion into comedy, and I should have recognized that something was wrong. I'm sorry." Keith waved him off. "You were doing your job. How could you know?" But Letterman wouldn't let himself off the hook. "That's the thing, though. My job isn't just to get laughs. It's to actually see the people sitting across from me. And I didn't see you. I saw Keith Richards, the rock star, the legend, the guy who'd probably slept through worse than my interview. I didn't see Keith Richards, the grandson who just lost someone he loved." Keith looked at Letterman with something approaching respect. Not many people would admit that on live television. Letterman turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to say something. When Keith fell asleep, I made jokes. The audience laughed. We all thought it was funny, but it wasn't funny. It was a man who hadn't slept in 2 days because he was sitting with his dying grandfather. And instead of recognizing that, instead of showing compassion, I went for the joke.
That's on me, and I'm sorry."
The audience applauded, but it wasn't the usual enthusiastic applause. It was quieter, more thoughtful. Keith spoke again. "My grandfather used to tell me that music was about honesty. Not just honest music, but being honest about who you are and what you're feeling. I wasn't being honest tonight. I should have told people why I was tired. I should have said I just lost someone important. But I thought I had to be professional, had to keep it together, had to be Keith Richards, the rock star, instead of Keith Richards, the person." Letterman nodded. "We all do that, don't we? We hide what we're really feeling because we think that's what we're supposed to do." Keith smiled slightly. "Yeah, and it's exhausting." Letterman smiled back. "Well, you literally fell asleep from exhaustion, so I'd say that's proof." It was a gentle joke, and this time Keith laughed. The tension broke slightly. Letterman asked, "What was your grandfather like?" Keith's expression softened. "He was the best man I've ever known. He taught me everything that matters, not just about music, but about being decent, about caring for people, about using whatever gifts you have to make the world a little better. Every good thing about me came from him, and now he's gone, and I don't know how to be without him." The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Letterman asking genuine questions about Theodore, about Keith's memories, about what Theodore meant to him. They didn't talk about the album or the tour. They talked about loss and love, and the ways our ancestors shape who we become. It was the most honest, least entertaining segment Late Night with David Letterman had ever aired. It was also the most important. After the show, Letterman found Keith in his dressing room. "Keith, thank you for being so honest out there. You turned my mistake into something meaningful." Keith shrugged. "We were both just trying to do our jobs. You handled it well when it mattered." Letterman sat down. "Can I ask you something? Why did you come tonight? Why not cancel and go to your grandfather's funeral?" Keith thought about it. "Because my grandfather spent his whole life teaching me that music was the most important thing. Not fame, not success, but the actual act of making music and connecting with people. If I'd canceled to sit at a funeral, I'd be honoring his death. By coming here, by working, by eventually talking about him to millions of people, I'm honoring his life. Does that make sense?" Letterman nodded. "It does. And for what it's worth, those millions of people now know about Theodore Augustus Dupree. They know what he meant to you. They know the kind of man who shaped Keith Richards. That's a pretty good legacy." Keith's eyes filled with tears again. "Yeah, he'd like that." The footage of that interview became legendary in television history. Not for the comedy, though the initial falling asleep moment and Letterman's jokes are still funny in isolation, but for what happened after. For Letterman's apology, for Keith's honesty, for the transformation of the interview from entertainment to humanity. Journalism schools use the footage to teach students about the responsibility that comes with having a platform, about the importance of seeing guests as human beings rather than content to be exploited. The segment is often titled, "The Moment David Letterman Became a Better Interviewer." Before that night, Letterman was brilliant but cold, more interested in jokes than connection. After that night, something changed. He never stopped being funny, but he became more aware, more careful about when to make jokes and when to show humanity. Years later, Letterman would say that Keith Richards taught him more about interviewing in 15 minutes than he'd learned in his entire career before that. Keith attended his grandfather's funeral 3 days later. In his eulogy, he told the story of falling asleep on Letterman, of the jokes and laughter, then of the honesty that followed. "My grandfather always said music was about truth," Keith said. "That night, in front of 40 million people, I told the truth. About him, what he meant to me, what he taught me. That's the best tribute I could give him." The Theodore Augustus Dupree Foundation for Music Education added a new memorial scholarship in Theodore's memory, supporting students who've lost family members who introduced them to music.
The application asks one simple question: who taught you to love music, and what would you want them to know about what their gift meant to you? Keith reads every application personally, and every year on the anniversary of Theodore's death, Keith appears on talk shows telling detailed stories about his grandfather, about the guitar, the lessons, the love. Not to promote albums or tours, just to keep Theodore's memory alive in the hearts of millions who never met him. If this moving story about grief, honesty, and the importance of seeing people as human beings rather than entertainment moved you, subscribe and share. Have you ever hidden grief behind professionalism? Share your story in the comments.